Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Ready to dive back into a little presidential history today with one of my favorite people to ever serve in the office of president. I don't think he's one of the greatest presidents, like he's not a top 10. Probably in that 10 to 20 range for me, though, and I think that his image is improving with time. Even now, more than 100 years after he left office, and that is Ulysses S. Grant. We're looking at the channel Resyndicated, which does a lot of presidential history, and as always, I'll put the link down in the description if you want to check out their channel. It's a relatively small channel, so I think we could give them a big boost by sending some new subscribers their way. So if you like what you see, check out some of their other videos. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Michael in Saratoga, California, and also Andela. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. From Serbia, thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Number 10. Ulysses S. Grant was elected president at age 46, making him the youngest man elected up to that point.
I like the fact that 46 is young in this context, because I'm 46. But yeah, people forget that Grant was in his early 40s, like a lot of these generals in the American Civil War. They were young guys, comparatively speaking.
To this day, he still holds the title as fourth youngest man to ever serve as president.
Yeah, so let's look at the list of youngest presidents, and some people you might not expect to be on there, right? Theodore Roosevelt, still the youngest man to ever be president, though John F. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president. And then Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Isn't it interesting that the three most recent Democrats to become president, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, you have the third and fifth youngest ever presidents and the oldest ever president in that group. It's just, I always found that fascinating. And it's interesting, too, that we went from, we've had three of our last four presidents were basically from the same summer they were born. Trump, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton were all born the same summer, within like 6 or 8 weeks of each other. And then Barack Obama was born in 61. But yeah, young guys. I mean, and then you've got Grover Cleveland, Franklin Pierce, James Garfield, James Polk, who died right after he left office, so he's a pretty young guy, and Millard Fillmore.
He was also exceptionally young when compared to most of the other great general presidents, such as Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, and Dwight Eisenhower.
And we've had other presidents who were generals. William Henry Harrison, Franklin Pierce was a general. Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield were generals. Rutherford B. Hayes was a general. But yeah, these were the guys who hit like that higher status, that led armies, that led even the entire nation's army in the field.
Who were all over 60 when they took office. Number 9. Grant was the last president to own a slave. When Grant was in his mid-30s and struggling to get by, his father-in-law gifted him a slave named William Jones. Grant owned Jones for only a few months before setting him free, and never owned another slave.
Yeah, so Grant grows up in an abolitionist family in southwestern Ohio. He's from a little town not far from Cincinnati. His father's very abolitionist. They actually had been neighbors of John Brown when they lived in northeast Ohio before Grant was born. And he marries a slave-owning family. Julia Dent, her family's from Missouri. She's a cousin of James Longstreet. And her father could not have been more opposite from his father. Very staunchly slave-owning family. And Grant struggled mightily in trying to make a living for his family. And so his father gifts him this slave. And the man, had he sold him, could have been worth about $1,000, which would have been life-changing money for Grant at the time. And so this shows you the principle of the man, that he took him downtown and gave him his papers and set him free, despite the fact that he could have desperately used the money that would have come from selling him.
He became increasingly opposed to slavery over time, but wasn't so much as a young man. In one letter to a friend, he wrote, quote, "I was never an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery." Number 8.
Yeah, and that's true for a lot of Union generals. You could say the same thing for Sherman, for sure. But Grant ends up, to his credit, like a lot of people, I think as the times change and as you become more educated on an issue, your views on it will often evolve. I mean, think about it in your own life. I mean, very few of us have the exact same opinions on every single issue that we did 20 years earlier, if we're old enough to be able to have formed opinions 20 years ago. I certainly can say that about myself, and I'm a pretty stubborn guy. And Grant even said, had he been eligible to vote in 1860, which he wasn't, he would not have voted for Lincoln. So, there was a lot of variety of opinion among Union leadership.
Grant was the first two-term president in over 30 years.
Yeah.
The last president
Jackson
to serve out 2 full terms had been Andrew Jackson, who finished his second term in 1837.
So that just goes to show you what a miserable bunch of presidents we had in that time period. That's a period between, obviously some of these presidents, like Lincoln, for example, had been elected to 2 full terms, but Lincoln died before finishing the second term. You've got a whole stretch in there where you got a lot of one-term presidents who just were not very good. And it shows the very fluid nature of politics at that time, too.
Grant began his first term in 1869, 32 years later. Abraham Lincoln was elected to a second term in 1864. However, he was assassinated only a month into it. Not only did Grant win 2 terms, but he did so with large electoral margins both times. Number 7.
And he did actually kind of flirt with running for a third term. It didn't end up happening, though.
Through his whole life, Grant was known for his good-hearted and compassionate nature.
That's true.
As a child, he would go on hunting trips with other boys, but refused to shoot anything. He also hated bullying and often defended smaller kids. Later.
And he also was really turned off by bad language. There's a story of a time that he said the word darn, and it ate at him for weeks that he did that. He very, very, very rarely used any coarse language. Hated the sight of blood. He grew up, his father was a tanner, and it made him sick. But at the same time, considered a butcher by a lot of people north and south because of the amount of casualties that took place in the battles he was involved in.
When he witnessed bullfighting in Mexico, he was so disgusted by the treatment of animals that he described the matadors as murderers.
Yeah.
Even upon meeting the surrendering Confederate forces at Appomattox, he said he felt, quote, sad and depressed seeing his defeated foe.
I've said this before, and if you're new to the channel or you maybe haven't heard me talk about Grant, there are a few people that jump out in my mind that have held the office of president that I just feel are just really just exceptionally good and decent people. And I'm not saying that a lot of presidents haven't been good people. I think by and large, most of them are. I think there's a particular personality type that ends up president, though. You have to have a certain level of confidence and a certain kind of ruthlessness in some ways. Not that every president has had that, but I think there are certain personality types that tend to rise to the top to an office like that. And so it can be exceptionally rare to find people who just seem like they're just very genuinely good, decent people that just don't seem to have much of any kind of, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but just seem to just generally be very, very good people, the kind of people I would love to have as a best friend. And the two that immediately jump out at me anytime I talk about that are Ulysses S. Grant and Jimmy Carter. And yes, you can find fault with both of those guys just as you can with every person who has ever lived in any kind of a leadership role. But by and large, even when they made mistakes, I think they did so from a standpoint of trying to do the right thing. And I just think they were just generally very, very good people.
Number 6. Today, Grant's presidency is primarily remembered for the rampant corruption.
Yeah.
Grant himself is almost never accused of being corrupt, but rather, historians point to his trusting nature, having allowed conniving politicians to get the best of him.
And this goes not just for his presidency, in his personal life, he was way too trusting. And if there's a major fault, one of major faults that Grant has, it's that he could be a little naive when it came to people taking advantage of him. So yeah, I don't believe for a second that he was personally corrupt, but unfortunately because he was naive and trusted people too easily, he allowed corruption to happen in his administration and in his personal life.
Nevertheless, he's received praise for his willingness to defend the freedmen in the South and his effectiveness in doing so, such as overseeing the passage of the 14th Amendment and using military force to destroy the early Ku Klux Klan.
Absolutely one of our best presidents when it comes to civil rights. Established the Justice Department specifically to fight for and deal with the rights of the freedmen, as they were called, men, women, and children who were newly freed from slavery. He did. He destroyed the Klan, and the Klan really was non-existent as an influential force again until the administration of you-know-who in the 20th century.
Number 5. Grant was actually born with the name Hiram Ulysses Grant.
Yep.
Early in life, he dropped Hiram, largely because he hated being teased for having the initials HUG.
And that sounds like one of those things that somebody made up, but it seems to have genuinely been true. That he hated that his initials were Hiram Ulysses Grant, HUG. Even from an early age, even when he still had the name Hiram, he was always known as Ulysses or as Ulysses. And this was a common thing. A lot of people went by their middle names back then.
Or Hug. The S only became his middle initial because of a clerical error when he was applying for West Point Academy.
And I wouldn't say when he was applying, because he didn't really have much of a role in his application to West Point. His father's kind of responsible for that. Grant wanted no part of going to West Point. In fact, he talks openly about the fact, because there was some talk at the time in the 1840s that they were going to shut West Point down. And Grant had heard these rumors, and as he was traveling to West Point, he found himself hoping that it happened, hoping that they would shut it down. His father wanted him to get a good education. A spot opened up at West Point. He had some good political connection that allowed him to get a congressional appointment for his son. It was a free education, college education. And Grant, really, once he went to West Point and he graduated, he never really wanted a career in the Army. He actually thought about, his goal was kind of to be a professor at West Point. He wanted to come back and teach math or something. He was really good in certain subjects. He wasn't what I'd call a brilliant student, but in the areas where he was strong, he was very strong. And so he would have probably made a good professor, though I don't know if he would have been kind of too bored with that and maybe drank a little too much.
Number 4. Grant's rival in the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, is often renowned as one of the greatest military generals of the Civil War
Grant
and
was
sometimes in United States history. Grant didn't think as highly of him, saying he feared Confederate generals such as Joe Johnston much more than Lee.
100% true, and I say this all the time. Grant, and if you have any interest in the Civil War, Grant's memoirs are phenomenal. They're a really easy read. Like, his style of writing is really good, and it's very easy to get an image of what he's trying to portray. I've done some other autobiographies from Civil War generals like Longstreet, which I struggled with because it sounded so much. Longstreet's came across like he was trying to really convince people how smart he was. I don't know if that was intentional, but it came across that way. Grant didn't seem to have any pretense of trying to convince anybody of anything. He was just telling his story, and you have to remember he wrote most of that while he was dying of cancer. Finished it like a week before he died. And yeah, he did. Joe Johnston, he considered to be the Confederacy's best general, and it's hard to argue with his logic. It's difficult because we don't have the sample size. Joe Johnston was not a favorite of Jefferson Davis, who loved to play favorites, and so Johnston never really got the opportunity to show what he could do.
Describing Lee as an overly conservative and cautious leader who benefited greatly from having a unified South behind him, rather than any special kind of genius. He also criticized his leadership style on a more personal level, calling him a headquarters general who was often inaccessible to his men. Number 3. Despite being America's second Republican president, Grant was initially opposed to the party. In 1856, he voted for Democrat James Buchanan over Republican John C. Fremont. He was worried the Republican position on slavery would lead to secession. Prior to the Civil War, Grant tended to vote Democrat, though he didn't vote down the party line, believing that a man's capability for any given office didn't depend on his political party.
I'll take a little exception with the way that was portrayed because, honestly, Grant didn't get to vote much. He spent a lot of his early life in the military, and at the time, the military, well, when they were deployed, could not vote. And then he moved around a lot. He lives in Missouri for a while after he leaves office. Then he goes to Galena, Illinois. And he's kind of bouncing around, and he was never anywhere long enough to be able to establish residency to be able to vote. I'm not entirely convinced that he voted in 1856, but maybe he did. I know he definitely didn't vote in 1860, but he said he probably would have voted for Stephen Douglas or maybe John Bell, but certainly not Lincoln.
Number 2. Grant is featured on the $50 bill.
Yep.
The bill has been around since 1861, with early versions featuring either Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, or Henry Clay. Grant's portrait was first used in 1913 and has remained on the bill ever since. Number
years.
1.
I've said this before, but I really wish that we would get more creative with our money and not have the same people on it all the time. I mean, my entire life, we've had the same people on the same bills, at least all the ones that are commonly in currency. I've got George Washington on the dollar bill, Lincoln on the 5, Hamilton on the 10, Andrew Jackson on the 20, Grant on the 50, Benjamin Franklin on the 100. We need to mix it up a little bit.
Final year and a half of Grant's presidency, no former presidents were alive. Franklin Pierce died during his first term, and then Millard Fillmore and Andrew Johnson during his second. Only 3 other presidents share this distinction with Grant: George Washington, who had no predecessors, John Adams, as Washington died during his term, and in more recent years, Richard Nixon. For more videos like this, consider...
I didn't know that one. That's actually really interesting. Fascinating stuff. So let me know your thoughts. Add to that. I'll throw up some links to some other videos I've done on Grant where we dive a little bit deeper into his story. It's a fascinating story that I think needs more attention, especially his early life before he was in the Civil War. Impressive guy, really is. Not a perfect guy, but a guy that probably isn't talked about enough in American history. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. And I just want to give a real quick shout out and a thank you to Nathaniel. Sorry, I don't know where you're from, Nathaniel, but also Kyle from Grapeview, Washington. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, the link is in the description. It's always up here on the screen as well, where you can go to Patreon and sign up to support the channel. Thanks for watching.